The hospital corridor was already crowded when the stretcher came through the emergency doors, but nobody moved quickly enough for the nurse watching from the treatment station. The Marine on the stretcher was losing consciousness, and the physician beside him kept repeating the same instruction: wait for the specialist, while the nurse knew that waiting might leave them with nothing to treat. She was named Elena Brooks, and for 12 years she had learned to obey hospital protocol down to the smallest detail, because protocols existed for a reason and because one wrong decision could follow a medical professional for the rest of her career. Yet, as she stepped toward the stretcher, something about the Marine's breathing made her stop. It was not the obvious signs that caught her attention. It was the rhythm. Uneven. Fading. Familiar. The emergency department smelled of antiseptic, coffee, and rain carried in on uniforms and coats, while monitors sounded from behind half-closed curtains and nurses called out numbers across the room. Elena had worked enough night shifts to know that hospitals develop their own language after midnight, a language of footsteps, alarms, whispered instructions, and doors opening just before someone shouted for help. She glanced at the Marine's face. He looked young enough to have a lifetime ahead of him, but exhaustion had settled around his eyes, and the identification card clipped near his belongings marked him as an active-duty Marine. His uniform had been removed for treatment, leaving only the small personal items that had arrived with him, including a worn metal bracelet and a photograph folded carefully inside a clear plastic sleeve. Elena noticed the photograph for only a second before another nurse moved between them. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Hale, leaned toward her and said they were waiting for the trauma specialist. Elena nodded. She understood. She had no desire to challenge him in front of the staff. But when she checked the Marine again, the uneasiness returned. Something was wrong. She quietly asked for another monitor reading, then looked toward the doors. The specialist was still several minutes away. Several minutes did not sound like much until a person was the one who needed them. Elena looked at the physician. He was already turning toward another patient. She looked back at the Marine. His eyes opened briefly. They were unfocused, but for one instant he seemed to recognize her. Then they closed again. Elena made her decision. She moved. She did not announce it dramatically. She simply reached for the equipment she needed and began the emergency intervention she had been trained to perform years before. A senior nurse immediately noticed and told her to stop. Elena did not argue. She explained calmly that the patient's condition was changing and that she believed the intervention could stabilize him long enough for the specialist to arrive. Dr. Hale returned and his expression hardened when he realized what she had done. He told her she had stepped outside the approved procedure. Elena knew exactly what that meant. She could lose her position. She could face a formal review. Her professional record could carry the decision for years. But she also knew that standing still would not protect the patient. The room became strangely quiet around them. Even the ordinary sounds of the emergency department seemed distant for a moment. Elena kept her attention on the Marine. She watched the monitor. She listened to his breathing. She waited. Then the numbers began moving in the direction she had hoped. The change was small at first. Almost too small to trust. Then it continued. The Marine stabilized enough for the arriving specialist to take over. Dr. Hale said nothing. Elena stepped back and removed her gloves, her hands steady even though her heart was not. The specialist took one look at the Marine and asked who had initiated the intervention. Nobody answered immediately. Then another nurse pointed toward Elena. The specialist looked at her, then at the patient, and quietly said that her judgment had likely bought them the time they needed. Elena did not smile. She simply nodded and returned to her station. She had learned long ago that being right did not always feel like victory. Sometimes it felt like waiting for the consequences. An hour later, the Marine was stable enough to be transferred for further care. The emergency department slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but Elena could feel the tension that had settled over the staff. She knew an incident report would be filed. She knew the administration would ask questions. She knew the phrase protocol violation would appear somewhere beside her name. What she did not know was why the Marine's belongings had been placed on the counter near her station. The photograph was still visible through its plastic sleeve. Elena glanced at it while organizing a tray. There were several Marines standing together in the picture, younger versions of themselves, smiling beneath a bright overseas sky. Elena's eyes stopped on one man near the edge of the group. She knew that face. She had not seen it in years, but memory does not always disappear simply because a person wishes it would. Her fingers froze above the counter. Before she could reach for the photograph, the emergency department doors opened again. This time, the person entering was not a doctor, nurse, or worried family member. He wore the dress uniform of a Marine officer, and the room seemed to notice him without anyone saying a word. He walked directly toward the nurse's station. Elena looked up. The officer stopped in front of her and studied her face for several seconds. His expression was controlled, but there was something unmistakably searching in his eyes. Then he glanced toward the treatment area where the injured Marine had been taken. When he looked back at Elena, his voice was quiet. He asked her name. She gave it. The officer paused. Then he asked the question she had spent years hoping nobody would ever ask. Where did you serve? The question seemed to remain in the air long after the officer had spoken. Elena did not answer immediately. Around her, the emergency department continued moving, but the ordinary sounds suddenly felt far away. She could hear a monitor beeping behind a curtain, a cart rolling across the floor, someone calling for another set of gloves. Yet all she could see was the officer standing across from her, his eyes fixed on her with the quiet certainty of someone who already suspected the answer. Elena finally told him that she had served as a military nurse years earlier. The officer nodded slowly. He introduced himself as Colonel Daniel Mercer, commander of the unit responsible for the Marine lying in the treatment room. Then he asked why she had never mentioned it. Elena lowered her eyes. Because nobody had asked, she said. It was a simple answer, but the silence that followed made it clear that it was not the whole truth. Colonel Mercer glanced toward the treatment room and then back at her. He had already spoken to the attending physician. He knew she had acted outside hospital protocol. He also knew the intervention had stabilized his Marine. What he did not understand was how she had recognized the problem so quickly. Elena explained that experience had taught her to notice certain changes before equipment confirmed them. She expected the colonel to challenge her, but instead he asked where she had served. Elena gave him the name of the military medical unit. His expression changed. It was subtle, almost invisible, but she noticed it. He knew the unit. He knew the year. And when he asked whether she had been there during an overseas evacuation several years earlier, Elena went completely still. She told him yes. Colonel Mercer looked toward the treatment room again. The Marine being treated there was named Lucas Reed. He had been one of the younger members of that same operation. Elena had not known that when he arrived. She had only seen a patient who needed help. That was what made the situation harder. Her decision had been instinctive, but the instinct had been built from a past she had spent years trying to bury. Back then, Elena had been responsible for treating wounded service members during a chaotic evacuation. One night, an injured soldier had arrived with symptoms that looked manageable at first. She had followed the procedures she was given. She had waited for authorization. She had trusted the chain of command. By the time permission came, the window for action had narrowed dangerously. The experience changed her. She never spoke about it publicly. She left military service soon afterward and began working in civilian hospitals, where protocols were strict and predictable. She told herself that a quieter life would help her forget. It did not. Colonel Mercer asked whether Lucas Reed had been part of that evacuation. Elena said she remembered the unit, but she had never known every name. Mercer then told her something that made her chest tighten. Lucas had been there. He had been a young Marine who had watched the medical team work through the night. He remembered one nurse who had refused to leave an injured service member alone. Elena shook her head. She did not want the memory. She told him he was mistaken. But Mercer continued. He said Lucas had kept a small photograph from that night for years. The same photograph Elena had noticed among his belongings. Elena looked toward the counter. Her breathing became slower. She finally understood why the picture had felt familiar. It was not simply a photograph of Marines standing together. It had been taken after the evacuation, during a brief moment when everyone believed the worst was over. Elena had been in the background, barely visible beside the medical tent. Lucas had apparently kept it all these years. Before Elena could respond, Dr. Hale approached with an incident report in his hand. He told her the hospital administration would review her actions because she had knowingly bypassed protocol. Elena accepted the statement without protest. She knew the rules. She knew the risks. Colonel Mercer listened quietly. Then Dr. Hale explained that the patient's recovery was continuing, but there would still need to be an investigation. Elena said she understood. She was prepared to accept whatever consequence followed. She had never expected recognition or praise. She only wanted Lucas to survive. Then Mercer asked whether Elena would explain what had happened during the old evacuation. She refused at first. Not because she was angry, but because there were some memories that had become so tightly sealed that opening them felt like breaking something inside herself. Mercer did not pressure her. He simply said that Lucas had remembered her differently. He remembered a nurse who stayed when others were ordered to move. He remembered someone who kept talking calmly to frightened patients when everyone else was afraid. Elena finally looked at him and said that memory was wrong. She had not saved everyone. Mercer answered that nobody had asked her to save everyone. He asked her to tell him what she remembered about one particular patient from that night. Elena's face changed. She knew exactly who he meant. The room seemed to shrink around her. She remembered the patient, the orders, the delay, and the decision she had made afterward. She remembered believing that she had failed because she had followed instructions instead of trusting what she saw. That belief had followed her into civilian nursing. It was the reason she had acted today. The reason she had broken protocol. The reason she could not stand beside Lucas and wait. Mercer listened without interrupting. Then he told her the truth. The patient she believed she had failed had survived. Elena stared at him. For years, she had carried a memory built around an ending she had never actually witnessed. Mercer explained that the patient had been evacuated after she left, and had recovered enough to return home. But there was more. Lucas Reed had been one of the people who helped carry that patient to the evacuation point. He had spent years believing Elena was the nurse who had given him the courage to keep moving that night. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she looked away. She had spent years punishing herself for a failure that had never happened the way she remembered it. Yet Mercer was not finished. He told her that Lucas had asked him to find the nurse from that photograph if he ever got the chance. Then the door to the treatment area opened. Lucas was awake. He looked across the room at Elena. For several seconds neither spoke. Then his eyes moved to the old photograph on the counter, and his expression revealed something that made Elena realize the story was far from over. Lucas Reed looked at Elena as though he had been searching for that face for half his life. The exhaustion in his eyes had not disappeared, but something stronger had replaced it, something almost like recognition arriving after years of uncertainty. He asked if she was the nurse from the photograph. Elena tried to answer, but the words would not come. Lucas smiled faintly, and told her that he remembered her voice before he remembered her face. He remembered how calm she had sounded on a night when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. He remembered her telling frightened Marines to keep moving, keep breathing, and trust that the next few minutes could still change everything. Elena lowered her eyes. She told him she had only been doing her job. Lucas shook his head. He said that was exactly what everyone had told him about her, but he had never believed it was that simple. To him, she had done something different. She had stayed. Colonel Mercer stood quietly nearby as Lucas explained that the patient Elena believed she had failed had survived because of the time she had created during that evacuation. Elena had not known the ending because she had been transferred away before the final evacuation records were completed. For years, she had carried the worst possible version of the story inside her. She had convinced herself that following orders had cost someone a life. That belief had shaped every decision she made afterward. It was why she became so precise. Why she never ignored a procedure. Why she always checked twice. Why she had spent years terrified of making the wrong choice. And now, in the emergency room, faced with Lucas's failing condition, she had been given the same impossible choice in a different form. Follow the rules and risk losing precious time, or trust the experience that had once frightened her and act. This time, she acted. Dr. Hale approached with the incident report still in his hand, but he no longer looked angry. He looked uncertain. He had expected a disciplinary conversation. Instead, he had witnessed something he could not easily fit into a form. Elena had broken protocol, but she had done so with judgment, restraint, and a clear understanding of the risk. More importantly, she had saved time when time mattered. Colonel Mercer asked whether the hospital intended to punish her. Dr. Hale said the review would still have to happen. Mercer nodded. Then he said that a review was appropriate, but so was the truth. He explained that there was a difference between reckless disregard for procedure and a trained professional making a calculated emergency decision when circumstances demanded it. Elena listened without defending herself. She had never wanted anyone to call her a hero. The word made her uncomfortable. Heroes, she believed, were people who knew what they were doing. She had spent years believing she was someone who had simply survived her mistakes. Lucas quietly disagreed. He told her that sometimes courage did not look like confidence. Sometimes it looked like shaking hands that still reached for the right equipment. The sentence settled over the room. Elena finally looked at him. Then she looked at the photograph. The younger faces in it seemed almost unreal now. People who had once believed they understood what life would become. People who had gone to sleep expecting another morning and woken to a world that demanded more from them than they thought they could give. Elena remembered the night clearly now, but for the first time she remembered all of it, not just the part that had haunted her. She remembered the fear. She remembered the confusion. She remembered the patient who survived. She remembered Lucas carrying equipment through the darkness. She remembered herself making decisions with incomplete information because that was what the moment required. And she realized something she had never allowed herself to consider. The past had not been asking her to forget. It had been asking her to understand. Her old wound had become the reason she recognized Lucas's danger. The mistake she believed had destroyed her confidence had instead taught her how to notice what others might miss. The memory she had spent years trying to escape had quietly become the skill that saved another life. Lucas reached toward the photograph and held it carefully. He told Elena that he had kept it because it reminded him that kindness could exist in places where people expected only orders and fear. Elena smiled through her tears. She told him she was glad he had survived. Lucas answered that he was glad she had been there twice. The first time, she had helped him keep going. The second time, she had helped him stay alive. No one in the room spoke for several seconds. There was no dramatic applause. No celebration. Just the soft rhythm of hospital machines and the ordinary movement of people continuing with their work. That was what made the moment feel real. Elena had spent years imagining that redemption would arrive loudly, that someone would eventually explain why the past had happened and tell her she could finally stop carrying it. Instead, it arrived quietly, in the voice of a Marine who remembered her when she had forgotten herself. The hospital review was completed days later. Elena was not dismissed. The administration acknowledged that her decision had been outside standard procedure but had been made in a rapidly deteriorating emergency, and had contributed to stabilizing the patient. New training discussions followed, and Elena became one of the nurses asked to help teach staff how to recognize when clinical judgment needed to guide action within an emergency framework. She accepted, though she never called it a promotion. To her, it was simply another opportunity to make sure someone else would not spend years wondering whether they had done enough. Colonel Mercer visited once before Lucas was discharged. He thanked Elena, but she stopped him before he could say more. She told him that she had only done what any nurse should do when a patient needed help. Mercer looked at her and said that perhaps that was the point. The world often remembers the extraordinary moments, but lives are usually changed by ordinary people who choose not to look away. Elena never forgot those words. Neither did Lucas. And years later, when she would walk through a hospital corridor and hear the familiar rhythm of monitors, she no longer heard only alarms and warnings. She heard reminders that every patient carried a story no chart could completely describe, and every decision made in a moment of pressure could become part of a life someone remembered forever. Sometimes the most important act of courage is not breaking a rule, but having the wisdom to understand why the rule exists and the compassion to know when a human life needs something more. Elena had spent years believing her past was the place where she had failed. She finally understood that it had also been the place where she learned how to save someone when the future gave her only seconds to decide. And perhaps that is why some people cross our lives only once, yet leave behind a kindness that stays long after they are gone. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly helped you when you needed it most, carry that memory with you. And if you believe those small acts of courage still matter, share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Because sometimes a life is changed not by the person who follows every rule, but by the person who sees someone struggling, steps closer, and simply refuses to walk away. :